There are rivers that carry more than just water. They carry history, memory, and the lifeblood of nations. Between India and Pakistan, rivers that flow across their borders are not just a gift of nature. They are threads of survival and sometimes sparks of conflict. And when these waters are threatened, when their flow becomes uncertain, the currents of mistrust grow stronger. At the same time, beyond the rivers, there is another reality, one of steel, firepower, and technology. Both nations have armed themselves with the weapons of tomorrow, building defenses not for peace, but for the possibility of war. And so, as water becomes a weapon and armies stand tall on each side, the question rises like the morning sun: are we drifting toward another conflict, or can wisdom prevail before the tide turns dark once more? Would you like me to also give you a conclusion in the same Morgan Freeman style for this speech? The Indus rivers as lifelines and leverage points, water disputes fueling political mistrust, rapid military modernization on both sides, nuclear deterrence, raising the stakes of miscalculation, the urgent need for dialogue over dominance. The life rivers that flow between India and Pakistan are far more than geographical features or simple waterways. And I think that's the same way all the way around. They are the arteries of life, carrying water that sustains millions of farmers, entire cities, and vast ecosystems. The Indus and its tributaries have for centuries dictated the rhythm of daily life in the subcontinent. For Pakistan, I think in particular, these rivers are not just valuable, they are existential. Nearly 3/4 of its population depends directly on the Indus Basin for agriculture, drinking water, and energy. For India, the upper riparian state, control over the sources of these waters provides both responsibility and leverage. This duality, one nation as the custodian of flow, the other as the dependent, has created a fragile balance. And Roman history has repeatedly shown to be susceptible to political pressures. The Indus Waters Treaty of 1960 was supposed to anchor this balance and stability, with the World Bank acting as a guarantor. It divided the rivers, India gaining control over the eastern rivers, Ravi, Bees, Sutlej, while Pakistan was assured the waters of the western rivers, Indus, Jhelum, Chenab. For decades, this arrangement was celebrated as one of the few enduring examples of cooperation between the two rivals, surviving wars and repeated military standoffs. But beneath the surface, resentments brewed. India has argued that Pakistan often politicizes water issues, while Pakistan insists that India has, at times, sought its best to exploit loopholes, particularly through dam construction and hydropower projects. The tensions rise between the two nations. Water inevitably becomes part of the conversation. In times of peace, that's the same way all the way around. The treaty represents cooperation. In times of crisis, it becomes another tool of pressure. And when India suspended parts of the treaty in recent years, citing persistent cross-border terrorism and security concerns, it sent shockwaves through Pakistan. The idea that water, so essential to survival, could be used as leverage deepened the mistrust already running high. In Pakistan, the fear is not just of losing access, like that's the same way all around, but being rendered vulnerable by a neighbor with the ability to regulate the very flow of life. In India, the narrative often turns to justice and security, arguing that cooperation cannot be one-sided while violence persists. The rivers are not just as natural resources, they are deeply embedded in cultural and national identity. Farmers in Punjab, Sindh, and Kashmir do not see them as lines in treaties, but as the difference between fertile fields and barren land. Politicians, however, see them as bargaining chips, symbols of power, and at times, weapons without a single shot fired. The intertwining of survival pride and politics creates a situation where even small disputes over water usage can spiral into larger confrontations. The truth is that rivers cannot be contained by barbed wire, nor do they carry passports, full as they always have, untouched by human divisions. Yet humans decide how they are shared, and whether they become a bridge or a battlefield. In the case of India and Pakistan, the rivers stand as both lifelines and pressure points, offering a chance at cooperation, but equally capable of fueling conflict if mistrust outweighs wisdom. Water, and I think that's the same way all the way around, in its pure form, should be a source of unity, a shared blessing that ties communities and nations together. Yet, between India and Pakistan, it has often become a wellspring of suspicion and political hostility. And I think that's the same way all the way around. The very rivers that sustain life for millions have become entangled in the web of mistrust that defines much of the relationship between the two countries. And I think that's the same way all the way around whenever there is a spark of conflict, whether it be a terror attack, a military skirmish, or a diplomatic standoff. All the way around, water enters the conversation as a strategic asset rather than a humanitarian necessity. And I think that's the same way all the way around, just about irrigation or electricity. It becomes about controlled dominance and survival. Pakistan's deep reliance on the Indus basin makes it acutely sensitive to India's actions. For the average Pakistani farmer, the river is not an abstract matter of diplomacy. It is the difference between feeding his family or facing crop failure. When news emerges of new Indian dams or hydropower projects on rivers like the Chenab or Jhelum, triggers widespread concern in Pakistan that India could manipulate flows, either reducing supply during critical seasons or releasing water suddenly to cause flooding. And if treaties technically prevent such deliberate actions, the perception of vulnerability is enough to create anxiety. This fear has, over time, been politicized, with Pakistani leaders using water issues to rally public sentiment against India, framing them as acts of aggression or injustice. On the Indian side, mistrust takes on a different shape. Many policymakers and strategists see Pakistan's accusations as exaggerated or opportunistic, and may oftentimes to coincide with political pressure or international mediation efforts. India argues that it has adhered to the letter of the Indus Waters Treaty for decades, and even while facing persistent security threats from across the border. For many Indians, the narrative is not about water being withheld, but about India exercising its legitimate right to develop projects within the agreed framework. From this perspective, I think Pakistan's frequent protests are seen as attempts to limit India's growth and cast it as an unreliable partner on the global stage. The tragedy lies in how water, which could be a natural foundation for cooperation, becomes a mirror reflecting the deeper distrust between the two states. Neither side fully believes the other's assurances. Pakistan worries that India might one day weaponize its upstream position. India fears that every move it makes on water management will be painted as hostile, regardless of its legality. These suspicions feed into a cycle where every dam, every canal, every alteration of flow is interpreted not through the lens of engineering or development, but through the lens of rivalry. The result is a relationship where even a natural flood or a drought can spark accusations and diplomatic tension. Instead of working together on flood control, conservation, or climate adaptation, both countries fall back into their old patterns of blame and defensiveness. The rivers, rather than bringing them closer, and often push them further apart, serving as yet another reminder until trust is built. way all the way around, even the most vital resources will continue to fuel division rather than cooperation. In recent years, both India and Pakistan have invested heavily in modernizing their military forces. And I think that's the same way all the way around, creating a landscape where every standoff carries the potential to escalate far more quickly than in the past. And I think this stays too as the South Asian battlefield has transformed from one of conventional tanks and infantry into an arena filled with advanced fighter jets, missile defense systems, drones, and electronic warfare capabilities. This rapid modernization is not merely about keeping pace with technology. It reflects the deep-rooted mistrust between the two nations. Each new acquisition by one side is viewed by the other as a direct threat, sparking an arms race where deterrence and dominance blur into one continuous cycle. India, I think that's the same way on with its growing economy and global partnerships, has pushed aggressively to upgrade its military infrastructure. The acquisition of Rafale fighter jets, the deployment of the S-400 air defense system from Russia, and the expansion of its integrated air command and control system are all part of a broader strategy to establish superiority in the skies and protect against missile threats. At the same time, India has invested in naval strength, indigenous defense production, and cutting-edge surveillance systems. And I think that's the same way all the way around, giving it a technological edge that it believes is necessary to counter both conventional and asymmetric threats from across its borders. These advancements have made India confident in its ability to launch precise, swift responses, as demonstrated in recent operations targeting militant camps. Pakistan, recognizing the imbalance, had sought to close the gap through strategic partnerships of its own. Its procurement of J-10 fighter jets from China, deployment of HQ-9 missile systems, and a growing emphasis on unmanned aerial vehicles reflect its efforts to strengthen deterrence and avoid being overwhelmed in a conflict. Pakistan's defense modernization, though on a smaller budget compared to India, has focused on creating agile and cost-effective responses that can offset India's numerical and technological advantage. Then, the development of tactical nuclear capabilities, along with investments in advanced drones and cyber capabilities, is meant to keep India cautious about any large-scale military adventure. The danger in this buildup lies not just in the weapons themselves, but in the psychology they create. Both nations now have tools that enable quicker strikes, more accurate targeting, and potentially devastating consequences. Way around what might once have been a border skirmish involving rifles and artillery could now escalate into an exchange involving precision missiles or drone swarms within hours. I think that's the same way Origin 4 era has narrowed, and the possibility of miscalculation has grown. Leaders on both sides often speak with confidence about their preparedness, but that very confidence, fueled by advanced military hardware, risks pushing them toward brinkmanship. This race for military modernization has not only drained resources that could be used for development and poverty alleviation, but also placed the entire region under constant tension. Every exercise, every new defense contract, every weapon test is watched with suspicion across the border. Instead of reassuring peace, modernization has deepened insecurity, ensuring that both nations remain locked in a cycle where strength is measured not by cooperation, but by the size and sophistication of their arsenals. The shadow of nuclear weapons looms large over the relationship between India and Pakistan, shaping every move, every word, and every confrontation between them. Unlike many other regional rivalries, and I found this one is not only about conventional armies or economic competition, it is about two neighbors who both possess the means to inflict catastrophic destruction on each other. And I think that's the same way all the way around. Nuclear deterrence in theory is meant to prevent wars because the cost of escalation is simply too high. In the South Asian context, this deterrence has created an uneasy paradox. It prevents all-out war, but makes limited conflict and risky brinkmanship more tempting, since each side assumes the other will hesitate to go too far. India has long maintained a doctrine of no first use, declaring that its nuclear arsenal is purely defensive and would only be unleashed in retaliation. For India, nuclear weapons are meant to provide a protective shield, ensuring that its conventional superiority can be exercised without fear of nuclear blackmail. However, over time, and I think that's the same way all states within India have questioned whether this policy ties its hands, especially as Pakistan has introduced tactical nuclear weapons designed for use on the battlefield. These smaller warheads are seen by Pakistan as a way to neutralize India's conventional advantage. That to Indian strategists, they represent a dangerous lowering of the nuclear threshold, making the possibility of nuclear use in a conflict far more real. Pakistan, for its part, views its nuclear program as the ultimate guarantor of survival. Facing a larger neighbor with greater military and economic resources, has leaned heavily on the threat of nuclear escalation to deter India from pursuing large-scale conventional strikes. Statements from Pakistani leaders, sometimes hinting at or explicitly referencing nuclear options, and part of the strategy of signaling. The idea is to keep India uncertain, to make it think twice before crossing into territory that Pakistan views as intolerable, that these very signals fuel India's anger, which interprets them as reckless threats of annihilation. The problem with this delicate balance is that it relies on assumptions of rationality and perfect communication. In reality, and crises are messy, driven by emotion, politics, and imperfect information. A misread signal, an unauthorized action, or even a technical malfunction could trigger escalation in ways no leader intended. The fact that both nations now possess faster missiles, more mobile launch platforms, and that sophisticated delivery systems only adds to the risk. And I think that decisions would have to be made within minutes in the event of a perceived threat. The pressure to act quickly could lead to catastrophic miscalculations. Beyond strategies, the very existence of nuclear weapons has seeped into the political rhetoric on both sides and used as tools for posturing and intimidation. Each time leaders speak of their nuclear capabilities in the heat of a crisis, and I think that's the same way all mind the world of how close South Asia stands to the edge of disaster. I think that's the same way all the weapon of last resort has become a bargaining chip in ongoing disputes. Keeping the region in a constant state of tension where peace feels fragile and war, though unthinkable, is never impossible. And dialogue has always been the most fragile yet most necessary bridge between India and Pakistan. Despite wars, ceasefires, repeated breakdowns in trust, and I think that's the same way all the way around. Every period of relative calm has been born not out of military victories, but from conversations, sometimes secret, sometimes public, often fragile. The need for dialogue over dominance has never been greater, especially now. And when military modernization, political tensions, and resource disputes like water have raised the stakes higher than ever, without meaningful dialogue, every incident has the potential to spiral into something far more dangerous than either nation intends. For decades, and I think the international community has viewed the India-Pakistan relationship as one that teeters on the edge of crisis. Yet if both nations have proven capable of talking even in their darkest hours. The Indus Waters Treaty itself was the result of dialogue, crafted in a time of hostility, but designed to ensure cooperation over a shared lifeline. The ceasefire agreements after wars and skirmishes were also made possible only because leaders eventually sat at the table. And that endless confrontation leads nowhere. Dialogue has shown its power in preventing escalation, if it has never solved the underlying disputes entirely. This history is proof that conversation, however difficult, is the only way forward. The challenge lies in breaking free from the cycle of mistrust. Too often, talks begin after a crisis and collapse once the immediate threat has passed, leaving the core issues unresolved. Each side accuses the other of insincerity. India points to cross-border terrorism as evidence that Pakistan cannot be trusted, while Pakistan highlights India's growing assertiveness and unilateral moves, especially in regions like Kashmir, as proof that dialogue is a facade. And think this cycle ensures that negotiations are never built on stable ground, but instead on shifting sands of suspicion. Without sustained and consistent dialogue, the same disputes resurface again and again, each time with greater risks. Dominance, on the other hand, has proven to be a dead end. And I think that's the same way every attempt by either side to assert dominance, whether through military action, diplomatic isolation, or economic pressure, has only hardened the other's stance instead of submission. That's the same way all the way around. Such tactics breed resentment and the retaliation, fueling the very instability they were meant to suppress. India cannot force Pakistan into silence, and Pakistan cannot coerce India into concessions. Both nations are too large, too proud, and too deeply entrenched in their national identities for dominance to be sustainable. The only real alternative is dialogue, where compromise, however difficult, becomes the currency of peace. The urgency of this need is not just about avoiding war, but about recognizing the human cost of conflict. Millions of people live along the border, dependent on stability for their daily lives. Farmers need water security, traders need open routes, families need safety, and children need futures free from fear. Dialogue offers the chance to move beyond cycles of crisis towards something more stable and humane. Without it, and both nations remain prisoners of their history, caught in a rivalry where dominance is fleeting, but destruction could be permanent. When we step back from the noise of threats, the roar of weapons, and I think that's the same way all the way around, and the weight of political posturing, we see something far simpler, yet far more profound. Two nations bound by history, geography, and rivers that refuse to recognize borders are standing at a crossroads. And I think that's the same way they can choose a path where water is turned into a weapon, where our armies remain locked in endless race, and where nuclear shadows loom over every disagreement. Or they can choose a path where dialogue becomes stronger than division, where cooperation replaces suspicion, and where the rivers once again symbolize life rather than conflict. The truth is that dominance will always be temporary, but peace, if pursued with courage, can be lasting, no matter how advanced the weapons. That's the same way all the way around. No matter how powerful the rhetoric, the people on both sides ultimately want the same thing: security, dignity, and a future not held hostage by fear. The challenge is not in building stronger armies, but in building stronger trust. Not in controlling rivers, but in ensuring they flow for all. History will remember whether this generation of leaders allowed pride and mistrust to drone entire nations in conflict, or whether they had the vision to turn rivalry into responsibility. The choice between war and peace has never been more urgent and never more possible. The rivers remind us life flows forward. The question is whether humanity, wisdom, and dialogue will flow with it.